The gunshot echoed through the Montana wilderness as Eleanor Mackenzie pressed her back against the cabin door, her trembling hands clutching a baseball bat. Four massive gray wolves circled the three armed intruders in her front yard, their eyes glowing amber in the porch light. This wasn't how tonight was supposed to end. The lead wolf, Alpha with his distinctive blue eyes, had the gunman pinned against her pickup truck while Luna and Storm flanked the other two men who were now screaming for help. The third intruder dropped his weapon, hands raised in surrender as Shadow's low growl vibrated through the night air. Eleanor's weathered fingers found the phone, muscle memory dialing 911 despite her shock. She remembered bottle-feeding these same wolves as helpless cubs 4 years ago, never imagining they would one day save her life. 911, what's your emergency? This is Eleanor Mackenzie on Glacier Ridge Road, she whispered, watching her four-legged family hold three grown men hostage. I need police immediately. But how could she explain that the wolves she'd raised from babies had just become her protectors? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 4 years earlier, Eleanor Mackenzie had been a different woman. At 69, she moved through her remote Montana cabin like a ghost haunting her own life, setting 2 plates at breakfast before remembering she ate alone now. The silence pressed against her eardrums until she found herself talking to Frank's empty recliner, then to Sarah's photograph on the mantel, her voice echoing off pine walls that had once buzzed with family laughter. The medical bills from Frank's 2-year battle with lung cancer had drained their retirement savings faster than Montana's snow melted in spring. Now, 6 months after burying her only daughter, Eleanor faced foreclosure notices that arrived with the cruelty of winter storms. Her teacher's pension barely covered utilities for the 1,200-square-foot cabin that sat 12 miles from the nearest neighbor, where cell phone towers couldn't reach, and loneliness had become her only companion. Sarah had been driving back from Missoula that terrible October night, her Honda Civic hydroplaning on rain-slicked Highway 2. The state trooper said she died instantly, but Eleanor knew better. She'd heard the fear in Sarah's voice during their last phone conversation, the hurt when Eleanor had hung up mid-sentence after another argument about money, about Sarah's irresponsible husband, about choices Eleanor didn't understand. The voicemail light had blinked red for weeks afterward, Sarah's final words waiting in digital purgatory while Eleanor's pride prevented her from pressing play. The town of Whitefish, population 8,000, had divided opinions about Eleanor Mackenzie. Her former elementary students, now adults with children of their own, remembered her gentle patience with struggling readers and her legendary Christmas cookies. But grief had transformed the beloved teacher into something harder to recognize. She'd stopped attending church after the pastor suggested Sarah's death was God's plan, stopped grocery shopping when neighbors offered awkward condolences in frozen food aisles, stopped answering her door when well-meaning friends brought casseroles and conversation. The isolation suited her penance. She'd failed as a wife, watching helplessly as cancer consumed Frank's 68-year-old body, despite experimental treatments that cost more than their cabin's original mortgage. She'd failed as a mother, letting pride poison her final conversation with Sarah, choosing anger over understanding in a moment that could never be undone. The guilt sat in her chest like winter ice, heavy and unmelting. Eleanor's daily routine had shrunk to survival basics: instant coffee at dawn, canned soup at noon, frozen dinners while watching news programs that reminded her the world continued spinning despite her personal apocalypse. She'd sold Frank's tools, Sarah's jewelry, even her mother's china to pay mounting bills, watching their shared history disappear piece by piece to strangers on Facebook Marketplace. The financial strain meant choosing between heating and eating some months. Montana winters showed no mercy to the grieving or the broke, and Eleanor had become both. She'd started talking to Sarah's photograph each morning, explaining her day as if her daughter might approve or disapprove of her choices from beyond whatever veil separated the living from the lost. The knock on Eleanor's door came at 7:30 on a May morning when spring snow still dusted the Glacier National Park peaks visible from her kitchen window. She'd been talking to Sarah's photograph again, explaining why she'd eaten cereal for dinner 3 nights running, when the unfamiliar sound made her freeze mid-sentence. Visitors were rare enough to qualify as suspicious, especially this early. Through the peephole, she saw a tall man in a Montana Fish Wildlife Park's uniform, his weathered face serious beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Tom Whitehorse had the patient demeanor of someone accustomed to delivering bad news to people who wouldn't want to hear it. Eleanor opened the door cautiously, keeping the chain latch engaged. "Mrs. Mackenzie, I'm Officer Whitehorse with Wildlife Services. I have something in my truck that might interest you." His voice carried the careful neutrality of someone navigating delicate territory. "Found 4 wolf cubs about 6 miles north of here. Mother was killed by poachers 2 days ago." Eleanor's heart clenched as she followed him to his government pickup, where a large crate sat in the truck bed. Inside, 4 tiny balls of gray and black fur huddled together, their eyes barely open, ribs visible through thin coats. They couldn't have been more than 6 weeks old, still dependent on their mother's milk, now orphaned in a world that had little patience for wolves. "The sanctuary in Kalispell is full," Tom explained, his tone carefully neutral. "State policy says we're supposed to euthanize them. Can't release them back to the wild at this age, and nobody's equipped to hand-raise wolf cubs." He paused, studying Eleanor's face. "Thought maybe you might have a different opinion on the matter." Eleanor looked at the cubs, remembering Sarah's premature birth 32 years ago, how tiny and helpless she'd been in the NICU, how Eleanor had spent weeks learning to feed her with special bottles, to monitor every breath. These cubs had the same desperate vulnerability, the same need for someone to refuse to give up on them. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Eleanor's voice came out hoarser than intended. "Officially? Nothing. I'm documenting that I found no cubs, just tracks leading toward the Canadian border." Tom's eyes met hers directly. "Unofficially, these babies need someone with patience and a lot of time on their hands. Someone who understands that not every life needs saving, but sometimes the right person saves the right life at the right moment." Eleanor thought about her empty days, her conversations with photographs, her slow slide toward becoming the crazy old woman who'd lost everything that mattered. The cubs made soft, mewing sounds, calling for a mother who would never answer. The sound pierced something in Eleanor's chest that had been frozen since October. "How long do I have before someone official comes looking?" "Montana law prohibits private citizens from keeping wild wolves," Tom said carefully. "But sometimes paperwork gets lost, and sometimes wildlife officers get called to other counties for weeks at a time." He handed her a business card. "My personal cell number's on the back, in case you ever need advice about, say, hypothetical wildlife situations." Eleanor made her decision the way she'd made every important choice in her life, with her heart leading and her head scrambling to catch up. Bring them inside. The cubs were weaker than they'd appeared in the truck. The largest, a male with distinctive blue eyes that reminded Eleanor strangely of Sarah's, barely lifted his head when she touched him. The other 3, 2 females and another male, whimpered continuously, the sound of creatures who'd given up hope. Eleanor sent Tom to the store for puppy formula and bottles while she prepared a makeshift nursery in her living room, using old towels and a space heater to create a warm, safe space. When he returned, she mixed the formula according to directions meant for domestic dogs, hoping wolf cubs had similar nutritional needs. The first feeding attempt was a disaster. The cubs turned away from the bottles, too traumatized or too weak to accept help. Eleanor sat on her hardwood floor until midnight, patiently offering formula drop by drop, the way she'd fed Sarah during those frightening first weeks of life. Finally, at 2 in the morning, the blue-eyed male latched onto the bottle and began drinking. The sound of his suckling broke something loose in Eleanor's chest, a dam of grief that had been holding back more than tears. She found herself crying while she fed him, whispering the same words she'd used with newborn Sarah. "That's it, baby. You're going to be okay. Mama's here." By dawn, all 4 cubs had eaten. Eleanor named them while they slept in a pile of warm fur. Alpha for the blue-eyed leader, Luna for the smaller female with silver markings, Storm for the male with darker coloring, and Shadow for the smallest female who seemed to disappear into the group. She had no idea she'd just changed everything. 3 months into what Eleanor had started calling the wolf experiment, her quiet world exploded into chaos she never could have anticipated. The cubs had grown from helpless bundles of fur into 40-pound adolescents with personalities as distinct as human children, and their presence had somehow leaked beyond the boundaries of her isolated property. Mrs. Patterson, her nearest neighbor at 8 miles distance, had spotted the wolves during one of her weekly drives to check Eleanor's welfare, a kindness Eleanor had once appreciated but now dreaded. The 75-year-old busybody had called the authorities before she'd even reached home, her voice shrill with indignation when she'd phoned Eleanor afterward. "Those aren't dogs, Eleanor Mackenzie, and don't you dare try to tell me they are. I taught Sunday school for 40 years, and I know wolves when I see them. What you're doing is illegal and dangerous, and I won't have it in my neighborhood." The call from Wildlife Services came the next morning. Not Tom Whitehorse, but his supervisor, Regional Director Patricia Hayes, whose voice carried the crisp authority of someone unaccustomed to having her decisions questioned. "Mrs. Mackenzie, we have reports that you're harboring wild wolves on your property. Montana statute clearly prohibits private citizens from keeping wolves without proper permits, which you don't have. We're giving you 72 hours to surrender the animals for relocation or euthanization." Eleanor had hung up without responding, her hands shaking not with fear, but with a rage she hadn't felt since the hospital billing department had called Frank's chemotherapy treatments elective procedures. She looked at Alpha, who was sprawled across her living room floor like an oversized dog, his blue eyes tracking her movements with intelligence that sometimes unnerved her. "Over my dead body," she whispered to him, and his tail thumped once against the hardwood as if he understood both the words and the defiance behind them. The support came from unexpected quarters. Dr. Jennifer Clearwater, the local veterinarian who'd been secretly providing medical care for the wolves, arrived that afternoon with a manila folder full of legal documents and a determination that matched Eleanor's own. "I've been researching Montana wildlife law," Jennifer announced, spreading papers across Eleanor's kitchen table. "There's a provision for emergency wildlife rehabilitation that could apply here. It's never been tested with wolves, but precedent exists." Tom Whitehorse appeared at Eleanor's door that evening, officially off duty but carrying a bag of specialized wolf food and a troubled expression. "My supervisor's breathing down my neck about this," he admitted, "but sometimes chain of command gets complicated when you're dealing with federal, state, and tribal jurisdictions overlapping." Eleanor didn't understand the legal implications, but she recognized the underlying message. Tom was willing to risk his career to buy her time. The real surprise came from her former students. Word had somehow spread through Whitefish that their beloved Mrs. Mackenzie was in trouble, and a steady stream of adults who remembered her patient guidance through difficult childhoods began appearing at her door with offers of help. Maria Santos, now a successful lawyer in Missoula, drove up unannounced with a briefcase full of legal strategies. Danny Mitchell, who'd struggled with dyslexia until Eleanor's after-school tutoring helped him graduate, arrived with his construction crew and began reinforcing Eleanor's property fencing without being asked. "You saved my academic life in 3rd grade," Danny explained when Eleanor protested. "Least I can do is help save yours now." The story somehow reached social media, though Eleanor had no idea how. She didn't use computers, barely understood what going viral meant until Jennifer showed her the Facebook page someone had created. Save Eleanor's Wolves. Thousands of people from across the country were sharing the story of a grieving mother who'd found purpose in caring for orphaned wolf cubs. The attention brought both blessing and curse. Donations began arriving to help with legal fees and wolf care expenses, but protesters also appeared at the end of Eleanor's long driveway, carrying signs that read, "Wolves kill and protect our children." The irony wasn't lost on Eleanor. She was protecting children, just not the humankind these people were worried about. Alpha's behavior during this period began showing signs that made Eleanor question everything she thought she knew about wolves. He seemed to understand the tension surrounding their situation, positioning himself between Eleanor and strangers, exhibiting protective instincts that went beyond normal pack behavior. More strangely, he had developed a habit of sitting by Sarah's photograph each evening, as if keeping vigil. The 72-hour deadline approached like a storm front Eleanor could see but couldn't avoid. Wildlife Services had been delayed by a federal review of their authority in the matter, a bureaucratic tangle that Jennifer's legal maneuvering had created, but Eleanor knew the reprieve was temporary. On the 3rd night, as she sat with the 4 wolves in her living room, Eleanor made a decision that surprised even herself. She would not surrender them. If authorities wanted her wolves, they would have to take them by force, and she would make that as difficult as legally possible. "We're family now," she told Alpha, scratching behind his ears the way he liked. "And families don't abandon each other no matter what the law says." Alpha's response was to rest his massive head in her lap, his blue eyes meeting hers with an expression that seemed almost human in its understanding. For the first time since Sarah's death, Eleanor felt like she was exactly where she belonged, fighting for something that mattered more than her own safety or comfort. The real battle was just beginning. The legal victory came 6 months later, but not without a price that aged Eleanor beyond her 70 years. Maria Santos had worked miracles with Montana's complex wildlife regulations, finding precedent in a 1987 case involving a Native American reservation's right to rehabilitate injured eagles. The federal review had somehow expanded to include tribal sovereignty issues, creating enough bureaucratic confusion to force a compromise. Eleanor could keep the wolves under a special rehabilitation permit, subject to monthly inspections and strict containment protocols. The media attention transformed Eleanor's quiet corner of Montana into something resembling a tourist attraction. Cars with license plates from across the country began appearing on her rural road, their occupants hoping for a glimpse of the Wolf Woman of Montana. Local businesses in Whitefish started advertising wolf country tours, and the influx of visitors brought unexpected revenue to a town that had struggled economically since the lumber mill closed. Eleanor found herself reluctantly famous, her story appearing in magazines and television features that painted her as either a heroic wildlife advocate or a dangerous eccentric, depending on the publication's perspective. She granted few interviews, uncomfortable with attention that felt like it belonged to someone braver than she considered herself to be. The wolves, now approaching their 2nd year, had grown into magnificent adults. Alpha topped 90 pounds, his blue eyes and silver-tipped coat making him unmistakably the pack leader. Luna had developed the sleek grace of a natural hunter, while Storm's broader build and protective instincts made him Eleanor's shadow during public visits. Shadow, true to her name, remained the most elusive, appearing and disappearing like smoke whenever strangers approached. Eleanor's daily routine had evolved around the wolves' needs and natural behaviors. Dawn meant feeding time, using the specialized diet Dr. Clearwater had developed. Mid-morning brought training sessions where Eleanor reinforced the boundaries that kept the wolves from wandering beyond her 40-acre property. Afternoons were for exercise, long walks through the forest trails where the wolves could express their natural instincts under Eleanor's watchful supervision. The financial burden had eased considerably thanks to the crowdfunding campaign that continued generating monthly donations. Eleanor used the money carefully, upgrading her property's fencing system and building proper shelter areas that met the Wildlife Service's requirements. She'd also been able to catch up on her mortgage payments, lifting the foreclosure threat that had haunted her since Frank's death. But it was the emotional transformation that surprised Eleanor most. The wolves had given her a purpose that extended beyond mere survival. She found herself researching wolf behavior with the same intensity she'd once brought to lesson planning, learning about pack dynamics and communication patterns that helped her better understand her unusual family. The grief over Sarah's death hadn't disappeared, but it had evolved into something more manageable, a sadness that no longer consumed every waking moment. The educational program had developed organically. School groups began requesting visits, and Eleanor discovered she could translate her teaching skills to wildlife education. Children who'd never seen a wild animal larger than a raccoon sat mesmerized as Eleanor explained wolf pack hierarchy and hunting strategies. She watched shy students gain confidence when Shadow approached them cautiously and saw troubled kids find peace in Alpha's steady presence. Wolves aren't just predators, Eleanor would tell her young visitors. They're families. They take care of each other. They communicate. They grieve when they lose pack members. They're not so different from us. The comparison wasn't lost on Eleanor. She'd found her own pack in the most unlikely circumstances. 4 wolves who'd filled the empty spaces that Frank and Sarah's deaths had carved from her life. The wolves had given her reason to get up each morning, purpose beyond paying bills and surviving another day. Alpha's behavior continued to fascinate and sometimes unnerve her. He'd developed habits that seemed almost ritualistic, sitting by Sarah's photograph each evening, leading the pack in howling sessions that occurred precisely at sunset, and showing protective behaviors toward Eleanor that went beyond normal pack loyalty. Dr. Clearwater had mentioned unusual genetic markers in Alpha's blood work, something about rare DNA sequences that appeared in fewer than 1% of North American wolves, but Eleanor didn't pretend to understand the scientific implications. What she did understand was the bond that had formed between them. Alpha responded to her voice commands better than most domestic dogs, seemed to anticipate her needs, and positioned himself between Eleanor and any perceived threat with unwavering dedication. The other 3 wolves clearly recognized Alpha's special relationship with Eleanor, deferring to his judgment while maintaining their own individual connections with her. The winter had tested everyone's resolve. Montana's brutal cold required constant vigilance to ensure the wolves' health and safety. Eleanor had installed heated shelters and maintained a feeding schedule that accounted for their increased caloric needs during the coldest months. The isolation that came with winter storms had actually provided relief from the constant stream of visitors, allowing Eleanor and the wolves to develop their routines without external pressure. Spring brought new challenges. The wolves' natural instincts were strongest during breeding season, and Eleanor had to work with Dr. Clearwater to manage behaviors that could become problematic. The decision to have the wolves spayed and neutered had been difficult but necessary, both for their safety and to maintain Eleanor's permit status. The procedures had been performed by a wildlife veterinarian from the University of Montana, and all 4 wolves had recovered fully. The community's relationship with Eleanor had evolved as well. Initial opposition from ranchers had softened somewhat as tourism revenue became apparent, though tensions remained. The monthly town hall meetings still featured heated debates about wolf management, but Eleanor had gained allies among business owners who appreciated the economic benefits her unusual situation provided. Tom Whitehorse had become an unofficial advisor, helping Eleanor navigate the bureaucratic requirements that came with her permit. His monthly inspection reports consistently praised Eleanor's care standards and the wolves' health, providing documentation that helped protect her from critics who questioned her qualifications. "You've created something unprecedented," Tom told her during one of his visits. "A genuine human-wolf pack relationship that maintains the animal's essential nature while providing them safety and care. Wildlife biologists are going to be studying this situation for decades." Eleanor found the scientific interest both flattering and overwhelming. She hadn't set out to become a research subject or a wildlife pioneer. She'd simply refused to let 4 helpless creatures die, and everything else had grown from that single moment of determination. The approaching summer promised new complications. The Wildlife Service had indicated that Eleanor's permit renewal would require expanded facilities and additional safety measures. The costs would be substantial, but the continuing donations and tourism revenue seemed likely to cover the expenses. More challenging would be managing increased visitor pressure during peak tourist season. Eleanor had also been approached by documentary filmmakers and authors interested in telling her story. She'd declined most requests, uncomfortable with the idea of commercializing what felt like a deeply personal journey. The wolves weren't performing animals or tourist attractions. They were her family, and she guarded their privacy as fiercely as she would have protected Sarah's. As Eleanor sat on her porch one evening, watching the 4 wolves patrol the perimeter of their territory, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed. 2 years ago, she'd been a broken woman contemplating whether life was worth continuing. Now she woke each day with purpose, surrounded by creatures who depended on her and whom she'd grown to love with an intensity that sometimes frightened her. The guilt over Sarah's death hadn't disappeared, but it had been joined by something else. A sense that perhaps her daughter's spirit had somehow guided those wolf cubs to her door. Eleanor didn't consider herself particularly religious anymore, but she couldn't dismiss the timing as pure coincidence. The wolves had appeared when she needed them most, and she'd been exactly what they needed to survive. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Eleanor knew she would face them with the same determination that had carried her through the past 2 years. Her pack was complete, her purpose clear, and for the first time since losing Frank and Sarah, she could envision a future that held more than mere survival. The crisis arrived on a Tuesday evening in late October, exactly 4 years after Sarah's death, a timing so precise it felt like the universe's cruel sense of irony. Eleanor had been preparing the wolves' dinner when her phone rang with news that shattered the fragile stability she'd built around her unusual life. "Mrs. Mackenzie, this is Director Patricia Hayes from Montana Wildlife Services. I'm calling to inform you that your rehabilitation permit has been revoked, effective immediately. You have 72 hours to surrender the wolves for relocation to an appropriate facility." Eleanor's hand tightened on the phone receiver until her knuckles went white. "What are you talking about? My permit isn't up for renewal until next spring. Tom Whitehorse just completed his monthly inspection last week." "There's been a change in federal policy regarding private wolf rehabilitation," Hayes replied, her voice carrying the bureaucratic coldness Eleanor had learned to fear. "The new administration has determined that private citizens pose too great a risk to public safety. All existing permits for wolf rehabilitation are being terminated." The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. After 2 years of fighting for legitimacy, building facilities that exceeded every safety requirement, and proving that her wolves posed no threat to anyone, politics had undone everything in a single phone call. "These wolves will die in captivity," Eleanor said, her voice breaking despite her effort to remain calm. "They've never lived in the wild. They don't know how to hunt or survive without human care. You're essentially signing their death warrant. Mrs. Mackenzie, we have several qualified facilities that can accommodate your animals. This decision is final and non-negotiable. Wildlife officers will arrive Friday morning to assist with the transfer. Eleanor hung up without saying goodbye, her hands shaking as she processed the implications. Friday was 3 days away. 3 days to say goodbye to the creatures who'd saved her life as surely as she'd saved theirs. 3 days to dismantle the only family she had left. Alpha seemed to sense her distress immediately. The massive wolf approached Eleanor where she stood frozen in her kitchen, pressing his head against her hip in the comforting gesture she'd come to associate with his most empathetic moments. Luna, Storm, and Shadow gathered around her as well, their collective presence forming a protective circle that made Eleanor's throat tighten with emotion. "What am I going to do?" she whispered to them, running her fingers through Alpha's thick coat. "How do I let them take you away from me?" The phone calls began immediately. Maria Santos promised to file emergency injunctions, but warned that federal policy changes were nearly impossible to challenge successfully. Dr. Clearwater offered to falsify medical records claiming the wolves were too sick to transport, but Eleanor couldn't ask her to risk her veterinary license. Tom Whitehorse, when he finally returned Eleanor's call, sounded defeated. "I'm sorry, Eleanor. This came down from Washington. My supervisor received the directive this morning and there's no wiggle room. Even the tribal sovereignty angle won't work this time. The federal government is pulling all private permits nationwide." That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She sat in her living room with the 4 wolves arranged around her like furry bodyguards, trying to memorize every detail of their faces, their individual breathing patterns, the way Storm's left ear twitched when he dreamed. The thought of never seeing them again felt like dying, a grief so sharp it reminded her of those first weeks after losing Sarah. The media attention exploded when news of the permit revocation leaked. Eleanor's phone rang constantly with reporters asking for her reaction, protesters organizing rallies outside the state capitol, and supporters offering everything from legal assistance to hiding places for the wolves. The Save Eleanor's Wolves Facebook page gained 20,000 new members in 12 hours. But Eleanor knew the publicity wouldn't change anything. Politics operated on a different timeline than justice, and her wolves would be gone long before any meaningful legal challenge could succeed. Wednesday brought unexpected visitors. Danny Mitchell arrived with his construction crew, not to build anything this time, but to form a human barrier at the end of Eleanor's driveway. They'd taken vacation days to prevent wildlife officers from accessing the property, a gesture of loyalty that moved Eleanor to tears. "You saved my kids' education," Danny explained when Eleanor protested. "Now we're saving what matters to you." Similar scenes were playing out across the country. Eleanor's story had touched something deep in the American psyche, the idea that government bureaucracy could destroy a genuinely beneficial relationship between human and animal purely for political reasons. Protests organized in dozens of cities, with demonstrators carrying signs reading, "Don't break up families," and "Wolves have rights too." Thursday morning brought a development that changed everything. A massive early-season blizzard swept down from Canada, dumping 18 inches of snow in 6 hours and making the mountain roads impassable. The Weather Service predicted another 24 inches before the system moved on, effectively cutting off Eleanor's property from the outside world. Tom Whitehorse called with barely concealed relief in his voice. "Eleanor, the transport is postponed indefinitely. No way our vehicles can reach your place in these conditions, and it's too dangerous to attempt extraction by helicopter." Eleanor looked out her window at the swirling snow, feeling something like divine intervention in the storm's timing. The wolves loved snow weather, and she watched them playing in the drifts like oversized puppies, oblivious to the crisis that had consumed her for 3 days. The isolation brought an unexpected gift: time. Eleanor spent Thursday evening recording videos on her old digital camera, talking to each wolf individually, telling them stories about their lives together, promising she would never stop fighting for them. She didn't know if the videos would ever matter, but creating them felt like leaving a legacy, proof that their relationship had been real and meaningful. Friday morning dawned clear and cold, the storm having moved east during the night. Eleanor woke to the sound of helicopters in the distance, growing steadily closer. Her heart hammered as she realized the Wildlife Service had found a way to reach her despite the road conditions. Alpha's reaction was immediate and alarming. He began pacing the living room, his hackles raised, emitting low growls that Eleanor had never heard from him before. Luna, Storm, and Shadow picked up on his agitation, positioning themselves at the windows and doors like sentries preparing for battle. Eleanor grabbed her rifle from the gun cabinet, not to threaten anyone, but because Montana law allowed property owners to defend livestock from perceived threats, and her lawyers had confirmed that the wolves qualified as livestock under her permit, even a revoked one. The sound of the helicopters grew louder, but Eleanor noticed something else: vehicles approaching from multiple directions despite the difficult road conditions. Not government vehicles, but pickup trucks and SUVs belonging to her supporters who had somehow managed to navigate the snow-covered mountain roads. A standoff was developing that would test everyone involved, with Eleanor and her wolves at the center of a conflict that had grown far beyond a simple permit revocation. The entire country was watching, and what happened next would determine not just the fate of 4 wolves, but the principle of whether genuine love and care could triumph over bureaucratic indifference. Eleanor checked her rifle's safety and took a deep breath. Whatever came next, she wouldn't surrender without a fight. The standoff lasted 18 hours, but it felt like a lifetime compressed into a single nightmare that Eleanor would replay in her mind for years afterward. By Friday afternoon, her property had become the center of a media circus that stretched across 3 counties, with news helicopters circling overhead like mechanical vultures, while armed federal agents established a perimeter around her home. Eleanor barricaded herself inside with the 4 wolves, who seemed to understand that their world was under siege. Alpha positioned himself by the front door, his massive frame blocking any potential entry point, while Luna and Storm took up guard positions at the side windows. Shadow, true to her nature, had disappeared somewhere in the house, becoming Eleanor's secret weapon, a 90-pound wolf that federal agents couldn't account for in their tactical planning. The phone calls came every hour, federal negotiators trying to convince Eleanor to surrender peacefully. She disconnected her landline after the 3rd call, unable to bear hearing bureaucratic voices explaining why her family had to be destroyed for the greater good. Her supporters had formed a human chain around the property's perimeter, preventing federal vehicles from approaching the house directly. But Eleanor knew their presence was temporary. Eventually, cold and legal threats would drive them away. The media coverage had exploded beyond anything Eleanor could have imagined. Every major news network carried live feeds from her property, talking heads debating whether she was a heroic defender of animal rights or a dangerous extremist who'd lost touch with reality. Social media campaigns used hashtags like #StandWithEleanor and #WolvesAreFamily, while opposing voices insisted that federal law existed for good reasons and couldn't be ignored based on emotional appeals. Eleanor's former students had organized the most touching gesture. Her 2nd-grade class from 1987, now adults with children of their own, had driven from across Montana to stand with her. They held homemade signs reading, "Mrs. Mackenzie saved us too," and "Teachers don't abandon their students." Seeing their faces, older now but still recognizable, broke something loose in Eleanor's chest that had been frozen since this ordeal began. But Friday night brought the moment that changed everything. Around midnight, when the news crews had finally quieted and most supporters had retreated to warming stations in town, Eleanor heard unfamiliar sounds outside her home. Not the measured footsteps of federal agents or the voices of protesters, but something else. The crunch of snow under boots moving with predatory stealth. Alpha's reaction was immediate and terrifying. The normally calm wolf erupted into aggressive behavior Eleanor had never witnessed, his growls reverberating through the house like rolling thunder. Luna, Storm, and Shadow materialized from their positions, forming a defensive pack formation that spoke to thousands of years of evolutionary survival instincts. Eleanor grabbed her rifle and moved to the window, her heart hammering as she tried to identify the source of the wolves' alarm. Federal agents wouldn't approach this way. They operated with protocols and announcements, not stealth missions in the middle of the night. Through the window, she spotted 3 figures moving through the trees beyond her property line, clearly trying to avoid the federal perimeter. They carried equipment Eleanor couldn't identify in the darkness, but their movement suggested combat training rather than law enforcement procedures. The attack began at 12:47 a.m., according to the timestamp on Eleanor's security camera footage that would later be analyzed by investigators. 3 men in dark clothing breached her property from the north side, moving with military precision toward her house. They'd somehow evaded federal surveillance, suggesting knowledge of tactical operations that civilian criminals shouldn't possess. Eleanor's first thought was that anti-wolf extremists had decided to resolve the situation themselves, eliminating both her and the wolves to send a message about federal overreach. She'd received death threats during the past week from people who viewed her resistance as dangerous precedent that needed to be stopped permanently. But as the figures approached her porch, Eleanor noticed something that sent ice through her veins. The lead man moved with a slight limp that seemed familiar, and when he turned his head toward the house, security lighting caught his profile. Even in the distorted shadows, Eleanor recognized something about his features that made her stomach clench with impossible recognition. The first gunshot shattered her living room window, sending glass cascading across the floor where she'd been standing moments before. Alpha's response was instantaneous, a roar of protective fury that seemed to shake the house's foundation. The sound triggered something primal in the other 3 wolves, transforming them from domesticated companions into apex predators defending their territory. Eleanor dropped behind her kitchen counter, rifle clutched in trembling hands as chaos erupted around her home. The wolves had scattered to defensive positions with coordination that spoke to pack instincts she'd never seen them display. Through the broken window, she could hear men shouting, but their voices were panicked rather than tactical. Clearly, they hadn't expected the wolves to respond with such aggressive intelligence. Another gunshot, this one closer, followed by a human scream that made Eleanor's blood run cold. One of the intruders had underestimated what 90 pounds of protective wolf could do to human flesh when defending family. The sound was followed by Alpha's growling deeper and more menacing than anything Eleanor had heard in 2 years of living with him. "Get them off, Jesus Christ, get them off!" The voice carried an accent Eleanor couldn't place, but the terror was universal. These men had come expecting to deal with an elderly woman, not a coordinated pack of wolves who'd decided their territory was under invasion. Eleanor's mind raced through possibilities. Federal agents wouldn't approach this way. Local law enforcement was coordinating with federal operations. These were private actors with their own agenda, people who'd decided the legal process was taking too long or moving in the wrong direction. The third gunshot was different, sharper, more targeted. Eleanor heard Alpha's yelp of pain and rage, a sound that cut through her heart like a blade. Someone had hurt her pack leader, the wolf who'd become more family to her than most humans she'd known. That's when Eleanor Mackenzie, retired elementary school teacher and grieving mother, stopped being a victim and became something else entirely. Eleanor burst from behind the kitchen counter with a fury that surprised even herself, her rifle raised and her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "Get away from my wolves!" The words tore from her throat with decades of suppressed rage, grief over Frank's death, guilt over Sarah's final conversation, fury at a system that kept taking everything she loved. The scene in her living room was carnage. Alpha lay bleeding near the front door, a bullet wound in his left shoulder, but his blue eyes still blazed with protective fire. Storm had one of the intruders pinned against the wall, the man's rifle fallen useless beside him, as 90 pounds of wolf held him immobile through sheer terror. Luna circled a second intruder who was screaming and firing wildly into the air, more afraid of the wolf than concerned with accuracy, but it was the third man, the leader with the familiar limp, who made Eleanor's world stop spinning. "Marcus Kellerman," she whispered, recognition hitting her like physical pain. "I know you." The man froze at the sound of his name, his weapon lowering slightly as he stared at Eleanor with eyes that held more pain than hostility. Even in the chaos, even with blood on her floor and her wolf injured, Eleanor saw something in his expression that didn't match the violence of his actions. "You know me?" Marcus's voice cracked with disbelief. "How could you possibly? You were there," Eleanor said, pieces clicking together with horrible clarity. "October 15th, 4 years ago, Highway 2, just outside Missoula. You were the medic who tried to save my daughter." The admission hit Marcus like a physical blow. His rifle clattered to the floor as his hands began shaking uncontrollably. "Sarah Mackenzie," he whispered. "Oh God, you're Sarah's mother." The chaos around them seemed to pause. Storm's growls quieted to wary observation. Luna stopped circling her prey. Even the injured Alpha lifted his massive head to watch this exchange between the two humans whose pain had somehow brought them to this moment of violence. "She died in my arms," Marcus continued, his voice breaking. "I tried everything. 22 minutes of CPR, 3 units of blood, every emergency procedure I knew. But the internal injuries were too severe. The other car ran the red light doing 65, and your daughter never had a chance." Eleanor felt her legs give way, sinking to her knees on the blood-stained hardwood floor. 4 years of wondering about Sarah's final moments, 4 years of imagining her dying alone and afraid, and now she was learning that someone had been there. Someone had fought for her daughter's life. "Did she say anything?" Eleanor's voice was barely audible. Did she say anything?" Marcus's face crumpled with grief that seemed as fresh as Eleanor's own. "She kept saying she had to get home to you. That she had something important to tell you. Something that would make you happy. She was pregnant, Mrs. Mackenzie. She was coming home to tell you about your grandchild." The words shattered something fundamental in Eleanor's chest. Sarah had been carrying her grandchild, had been driving through the rain to share the most beautiful news a mother could receive, and Eleanor's pride and anger had prevented her from answering those final phone calls. "I've been carrying her last words for 4 years, Marcus continued, tears streaming down his face. "She said, 'Tell my mom I love her. Tell her I'm sorry we fought. Tell her about the baby.' But I didn't know how to find you. Didn't even know if you'd want to hear from the medic who failed to save your daughter." Storm's victim had stopped struggling, too shocked by the emotional revelation to continue fighting. Luna's target remained frozen against the wall, his weapon forgotten as he witnessed something more powerful than violence, the collision of two people whose lives had been destroyed by the same terrible moment. "You didn't fail," Eleanor whispered, her rifle completely forgotten now. "You were there when she needed someone. You held her hand when I couldn't. You heard her final words when I was too proud to answer her calls." Marcus fell to his knees across from Eleanor, the distance between them measured in blood and broken glass and 4 years of parallel grief. "I came here to rob you," he confessed. "Not for money, but because I've been following your story online. Seeing you find love and purpose after losing Sarah made me angry. I lost everything, too. My wife, my unborn child, my career, my sanity. But nobody cared about my story. Nobody crowdfunded my recovery." The truth was uglier than Eleanor had imagined, but it made terrible sense. Marcus Kellerman was a veteran who'd served 3 tours in Afghanistan, coming home to find his pregnant wife Jessica murdered during a home invasion while he was overseas. The double loss had shattered him, and Sarah's death in his arms had been the final break in his already fractured psyche. "You didn't come here for money," Eleanor realized. "You came here because you're carrying too much pain, and you thought taking mine would somehow lessen yours." "I've been watching your house for weeks," Marcus admitted, "waiting for the right moment. But when I saw the federal agents, saw them trying to take your wolves, I realized they were going to cause you the same loss I've been living with. So I decided to get here first, I don't know what I thought I was doing." Alpha chose that moment to struggle to his feet, blood matting his silver coat but his blue eyes alert and focused. Instead of attacking Marcus, the wounded wolf limped slowly across the room until he stood between Eleanor and the man who'd shot him, but rather than showing aggression, Alpha sat down and fixed Marcus with that unnervingly intelligent stare. "He knows," Eleanor said wonderingly. "Somehow he knows you were with Sarah when she died." Marcus stared at Alpha with recognition dawning in his eyes. "The blue eyes," he whispered. "Sarah had the exact same blue eyes. She kept them open until the very end, kept looking at me like she was memorizing my face so she could tell someone later that I'd tried to help." Dr. Clearwater's words about Alpha's unusual genetic markers suddenly took on new meaning for Eleanor. Not scientific significance, but something deeper, a connection that transcended logic and entered the realm of faith. Alpha had been born the night Sarah died, had those same distinctive blue eyes, had always shown protective instincts toward Eleanor that went beyond normal wolf behavior. "Marcus," Eleanor said slowly, "I need you to understand something. These wolves didn't just save my life. They saved my reason for living. When I found them, I was planning to die. I'd lost my husband to cancer, my daughter to a car accident, and my home to medical bills. I was taking pills apart, one by one, counting how many it would take to end the pain." She gestured toward Alpha, who continued his silent vigil between them. "But 4 orphaned wolf cubs needed me to live. They needed me to be strong, to fight for them, to become the kind of person who doesn't give up when everything seems hopeless. They taught me that love doesn't end when someone dies, it just finds new forms." Marcus's companions had given up any pretense of resistance, sitting quietly against the wall while this extraordinary conversation unfolded around them. One was crying openly, clearly recognizing something profound in the exchange between Eleanor and Marcus. "I can't bring Sarah back," Eleanor continued, "and I can't undo the pain you've been carrying, but I can tell you that your being there mattered. Knowing she wasn't alone, knowing someone fought for her life, knowing her final words were preserved, that changes everything for me." Outside they could hear vehicles approaching, federal agents finally responding to the gunfire. Soon, this room would be filled with law enforcement, investigations, legal consequences that would complicate everything even further. But in this moment, Eleanor Mackenzie reached across 4 years of grief and touched Marcus Kellerman's face with the same gentle compassion she'd once shown struggling students. "Sarah would want me to help you," she said simply. "And these wolves taught me that family isn't just about blood. It's about who shows up when you need them most. You showed up for my daughter when I couldn't. Now let me show up for you." Alpha's tail thumped once against the floor, as if approving of Eleanor's decision to extend their pact to include even those who'd come as enemies. 6 months later, Eleanor Mackenzie stood in the morning sunlight streaming through her kitchen windows, watching a scene that would have been impossible to imagine during those dark October days when everything seemed lost. Marcus Kellerman knelt in her backyard, carefully applying antibiotic ointment to the healed scar on Alpha's shoulder, while the massive wolf sat patiently, his blue eyes calm and trusting. The legal aftermath had been a labyrinth of negotiations, plea bargains, and unprecedented judicial decisions that made national news. Marcus had pled guilty to breaking and entering an assault with a deadly weapon, but Eleanor's testimony about his service to Sarah and his severe PTSD had resulted in a suspended sentence contingent on his completion of a residential treatment program. His two accomplices, Jake Morrison and Billy Hendricks, had received community service sentences that they were serving at Eleanor's newly expanded wildlife sanctuary. The federal permit situation had resolved in Eleanor's favor through a combination of public pressure, legal challenges, and what Tom Whitehorse privately called bureaucratic embarrassment. No federal agency wanted to be seen as the organization that destroyed a program that had captured America's heart, especially after the dramatic confrontation had been broadcast live on social media by supporters with cell phones. A new category of educational wildlife partnership had been created specifically to accommodate Eleanor's unique situation. Eleanor's property had transformed into something resembling a small campus. The original cabin remained her private residence, but additional buildings now housed a visitor center, educational facilities, and proper veterinary care areas that met every federal standard. The Wolf Recovery and Education Center welcomed thousands of visitors annually, generating revenue that supported not just the wolves, but also a broader program for wildlife rehabilitation throughout Montana. Marcus had emerged from the VA treatment facility as a different man, not healed entirely because some wounds never fully close, but functional in ways that had seemed impossible during his darkest months. The residential program had connected him with other veterans dealing with similar trauma, and the group therapy sessions had helped him understand that his pain didn't have to be a weapon he turned against the world. "Mrs. Mackenzie?" Marcus called from the yard. "Alpha's trying to tell me something about his breakfast routine. I think he's got opinions about the new food schedule." Eleanor smiled as she watched the interaction. Marcus had moved into the small apartment above the visitor center 3 months ago, officially serving as the sanctuary's security and maintenance coordinator, though his real role was more complex. He'd become the bridge between Eleanor's domestic relationship with the wolves and their wild nature, helping manage the pack dynamics that became more important as the sanctuary expanded. The wolves had accepted Marcus with surprising ease once Eleanor made clear he was part of their extended pack. Alpha seemed to understand that Marcus carried grief similar to Eleanor's, and the wolf's protective instincts had expanded to include the troubled veteran who'd found his way to them through violence but stayed through choice. Luna had given birth to 3 cubs that spring, despite the veterinarian's assurance that her spaying procedure had been successful. Doctor. Clearwater had called it a medical anomaly, but Eleanor preferred to think of it as life's insistence on continuing even when circumstances seemed impossible. The cubs, named Hope, Courage, and Faith by the children who'd won the sanctuary's naming contest, had become the stars of the educational program. Storm and Shadow had developed into the sanctuary's ambassadors, comfortable enough with trained humans to participate in educational demonstrations while maintaining their essential wolf nature. School groups visited weekly during the academic year, and Eleanor had returned to teaching in a way she'd never expected, sharing lessons about wildlife conservation, pack behavior, and the complex relationships between humans and predators. The phone call that changed everything came on a Tuesday morning in April, exactly 1 year after the October confrontation. Eleanor was feeding the new cubs when her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize, but the voice was one she'd been hoping to hear for months. "Mrs. Mackenzie? This is David Chen. I was married to your daughter Sarah." Eleanor's hands began shaking as she set down the bottle she'd been using to feed Hope. Sarah's widowed husband had disappeared after the funeral, unable to face the reminders of his lost wife and unborn child. Eleanor had tried to contact him repeatedly during the first year after Sarah's death, but he'd moved without leaving forwarding information. "David?" Eleanor whispered, her voice catching. "Where have you been? I've been trying to find you for 4 years." "I know," David replied, his voice heavy with guilt. "I couldn't face you after Sarah died. I blame myself for the job that took us to Missoula, for the argument that made her drive home alone that night. I've been living in Seattle, trying to start over, but I saw the news coverage about your wolves and realized I needed to come home." Eleanor gripped the phone tighter. "You don't need to blame yourself. Sarah loved you, and she was excited about the baby. The argument was with me, not you. I have something for you," David continued. "Sarah's voicemails from that night. She called me after she spoke with you, and I saved the recordings. I thought you might want to hear them." The voicemails arrived by email that afternoon, digital files that contained Sarah's voice speaking words Eleanor had never heard. Marcus sat beside her as she played them, his presence a comfort as she prepared to hear her daughter's final thoughts. Sarah's voice, recorded just hours before the accident, was filled with excitement despite the emotional weight of her argument with Eleanor. "David, I just told Mom about the baby and she didn't take it well. She's worried about money, about us being ready, but I know she'll come around. I'm driving home tonight to show her the ultrasound pictures. She's going to cry happy tears when she sees them." The second voicemail was shorter, recorded 20 minutes later. "The rain is getting bad, but I'm almost there. I can't wait to see Mom's face when I tell her it's a girl. We're going to name her Eleanor, after Grandma. Mom is going to be such an amazing grandmother." Eleanor sobbed as she listened to her daughter's voice, filled with love and anticipation for a future that would never arrive. But mixed with the grief was something else, a profound sense of completion. Sarah's final hours hadn't been filled with anger or resentment, but with excitement about sharing the most wonderful news a daughter could bring her mother. "She was naming the baby after you," Marcus said softly. "Your granddaughter would have been Eleanor." Eleanor looked through her kitchen window at the cubs playing in the yard, at Marcus teaching them to respond to simple commands, at Luna watching over her babies with the fierce protectiveness that all mothers understand. The circle of love hadn't been broken by death. It had expanded to include creatures and people she never could have imagined becoming family. 3 weeks later, David arrived at the sanctuary with a small box of Sarah's belongings he'd been unable to part with during his 4 years of grief. Among them were the ultrasound pictures Sarah had planned to show Eleanor, images of the granddaughter she would never meet but could finally properly mourn. David stayed for a month, helping with the spring preparations and learning to work with the wolves under Marcus's guidance. Eleanor watched her son-in-law rediscover purpose in caring for the cubs, saw him smile genuinely for the first time since Sarah's funeral when Hope climbed into his lap during an evening feeding session. "I understand now," David told Eleanor on his last night at the sanctuary. "Sarah would have loved what you've built here. She always said you had a gift for helping broken things become whole again." Eleanor nodded, thinking about all the broken things that had found healing at the sanctuary: orphaned wolf cubs, traumatized veterans, grieving families, and most importantly, her own shattered heart. The wolves had been the catalyst, but the healing had grown to encompass something much larger. As David prepared to return to Seattle, this time with plans to visit regularly and stay connected, Eleanor realized that her story had become something different than she'd ever intended. She'd thought she was simply saving 4 wolf cubs, but she'd actually been saving herself and creating a place where others could find healing too. That evening, as the sun set over the Montana mountains, Eleanor sat on her porch watching the extended pack that had formed around her. Alpha led the evening patrol with his cubs tumbling behind him. Luna supervised the training sessions Marcus conducted with the young wolves, and Storm and Shadow maintained their gentle watch over the humans who'd become their family. Eleanor pulled out her phone and did something she'd never done before. She called Sarah's old number, knowing it would go to a disconnected message but needing to speak the words aloud. "Hi, baby," she said to the digital void. "I wanted you to know that your mom finally understands. Love doesn't end when someone dies. It just keeps growing, taking new forms, reaching out to touch lives you never expected. Your wolves taught me that. Your Marcus taught me that. Your David is learning it too." Alpha approached the porch and settled beside Eleanor's chair, his massive head resting against her knee in the gesture that had become their evening ritual. Eleanor scratched behind his ears and whispered what had become her daily prayer. "Thank you for bringing them home to me, Sarah. Thank you for showing me that family isn't limited by species or blood or logic. Thank you for teaching me that love is the only force stronger than loss." The wolves began their evening howl as the stars appeared, their voices rising in harmony toward the vast Montana sky, carrying Eleanor's love to wherever Sarah was listening. Sometimes, life strips away everything we thought defined us, our spouse, our children, our sense of purpose, leaving us wondering if love itself was just an illusion that dies with those we've lost. Eleanor Mackenzie discovered something profound in her darkest hour. Love doesn't end when someone dies. It transforms, grows, and finds new ways to heal not just our own broken hearts, but the hearts of others who've lost their way. When 4 orphaned wolf cubs needed a mother, Eleanor found she still had love to give. When a traumatized veteran needed forgiveness, she discovered her grief had taught her compassion. When her grandson finally came home, she realized that family isn't limited by blood. It's defined by who shows up when we need them most. Eleanor's wolves didn't just save her life, they taught her that even in our 70s, we can build new families, discover new purposes, and create legacies that outlast our deepest losses. Her story reminds us that our greatest heartbreaks can become the foundation for our most meaningful chapters, if we're brave enough to let love find us again in unexpected forms. Share your thoughts. Have you ever found unexpected family or purpose after experiencing profound loss? What helped you discover that love continues even after saying goodbye to someone precious?